It was a hot day in 1933. Maurice Wilson, a renowned British man, was gripping the stick of his small, open-air plane tightly while watching the fuel tank running low. He had only learned to fly 2 months ago, but his biggest problem wasn't running out of fuel thousands of feet above the ground. It was a long list of issues, including some British officers he had left behind in Bahrain, the certainty of being arrested if he landed in Iran, the waves of the Persian Gulf below, and the growing possibility that he wouldn't make it to a safe place before the fuel ran out. Despite all of this, Wilson kept going because the mission he had embarked on was far bigger than these small issues. His mission was to crash his plane into the world's highest peak, Mount Everest. Maurice Wilson was born on April 21, 1892, in York, to a middle-class textile mill owner's family. If the Great War hadn't started when he was 16, he might have joined the family textile business, but instead, following in the footsteps of his older brother Victor, he joined the British Army on his 18th birthday, eager to get to the battlefield. Finally, in November 1917, Wilson was sent to France, where the Germans were attacking the British Army. By 7 a.m., the Germans had surrounded 3 of the 4 companies of Wilson's battalion, but Wilson, who was in the remaining D company, kept firing at the Germans from a machine gun post. Wilson was very stubborn enough to kill someone, but he survived the war without injury, the last uninjured soldier in his company. He was awarded the Military Cross for his bravery in stopping the German attack. However, just a few months after receiving this award, he was sent back to the front line. On July 19, 1918, Wilson was advancing with a small team when a German machine gunner spotted them and started firing. Wilson was shot in the back and left side but survived. The wounds caused him lifelong pain and weakness. For several months, Wilson was hospitalized due to his injuries. Afterward, he was sent to a reserve battalion, but trouble seemed to follow him. He contracted the influenza that was spreading worldwide at the time, and the illness sent him back to the hospital. World War I ended while he was lying in a hospital bed. During his treatment, Wilson wrote a letter to the War Ministry requesting a pension for his injuries. However, the ministry rejected his request, claiming his injuries were not serious enough to warrant financial support. This rejection deeply hurt Wilson, leading to a rebellion in his heart against the government. This resentment stayed with him until 1919, when he was sent to Dimbula Ford. Wilson now faced the same question as many other World War I soldiers. After sacrificing so much and enduring injuries, why was there no reward or compensation? Wilson was now broken inside, and he wanted to do something great with his life. He wandered the world for the next 10 years. During this time, he got married twice and switched businesses, but by 1932, he had still not found the peace he was looking for. His health was worsening, and the wounds from the war were still causing him constant pain. During this period, Wilson met a mystic who claimed that if he fasted for a few days, all his problems would be solved. Wilson actually fasted for several weeks, spending time in prayer. A few months later, he emerged completely healthy, free from both depression and illness. His belief that any problem could be solved by fasting and praying grew stronger. He then began to take on new challenges. He claimed that he would do something for the world using the power of fasting that no one had ever done before. Around this time, Wilson came across an article in the newspaper about the 1924 British Mount Everest expedition. George Mallory and Andrew Irvine had attempted to reach the summit of Mount Everest, but they disappeared somewhere along the way. Wilson now had a purpose. He decided to climb Mount Everest alone, relying on his fasting and prayers. But there was one problem. How could he reach the summit of Mount Everest? Wilson knew that such missions required a lot of money, various gear, and extensive training. However, he sought to bypass all these requirements and find a shortcut. In 1932, an expedition named the Everest Mission was making headlines. This mission involved a plane flying over Mount Everest for the first time, taking photos from above. At that time, no one had reached the summit of Everest, and the world was eager to see the peak. Wilson came up with a daring idea. He would join this expedition, and when the plane was over Everest, he would parachute out and be the first person to reach the peak. However, he soon abandoned this idea, deeming it impossible. Instead, he came up with a more dangerous plan. He would buy his own plane and crash land it on the snow at 15,000 feet on Mount Everest. That way, half the journey would be covered, and the rest he would tackle with his fasting and prayers. Here, it is important to note that Maurice Wilson had no experience in mountaineering or flying. He had done some basic practice for climbing mountains, but had never attempted to learn technical mountaineering skills. He then purchased a 3-year-old heavy-land Gipsy Moth plane, which had previously been part of a flying circus. It was a 2-seater wooden biplane, popular at the time in recreational aero clubs. He had Ever-Wrest written on the side of the plane, a name he had created himself which resembled Everest. During his pilot training, his instructor told him that he would never even reach India, but Wilson remained determined. Meanwhile, the British Air Ministry got wind of his mission and did not want him to carry out such madness. The British Air Ministry informed the authorities in Nepal about Wilson's plan, and they revoked his permission to enter Nepal's airspace. This was bad news because Wilson had planned to reach Everest through Nepal. However, Wilson was willing to go to any lengths to fulfill his mission. He called the media to the Stagan Aerodrome airfield in London, tore up and threw away the British Air Ministry's telegram in front of them, and took off without any permission. The plane, filled with extra fuel drums, could travel up to 750 miles. Wilson made refueling stops in Freiburg, Germany, Marseille, France, Pisa, Naples, and Sicily, Italy. It was a beautiful and nearly problem-free journey, but difficulties began after crossing the Mediterranean. In Tunisia, the police arrested him, but he was soon released. He also accidentally filled the fuel tank with water-contaminated fuel in Tunis, but managed to safely land in the city of Gabes, where he refueled. He continued his journey through Libya, passing through Tripoli, Bengito, and Alexandria, before heading for Egypt. When he arrived in Cairo, he received bad news. He couldn't find the promised permit to fly over Iran. He spent the entire day running around different British officials' offices, but the permit was likely deliberately delayed by the British due to bureaucratic issues. Instead of wasting more time, Wilson decided to fly directly to Baghdad. Iran was now in front of him, but he didn't have permission to land there, so he needed to find a new route. The problem was, he didn't have a good map. He landed in Baghdad and bought a children's school atlas, marking his route and heading for Bahrain. Meanwhile, the British officers started thinking ahead. They had already sent telegrams to the next stop, and when Wilson reached Bahrain, a British officer summoned him to his office. The officer informed him that there were no airstrips ahead for his small plane, and the only one was in Iran, where he would be arrested if he landed without permission. The officer also told Wilson he could refuel in Bahrain on the condition that he would head directly back to London. Wilson agreed to this, but when he took off, he didn't turn toward London. Instead, he made a sharp turn eastward, heading toward India. He passed through the Persian Gulf, avoiding Iran, and managed to find a new strip in Gwadar, which was once part of India. After several hours, when his fuel gauge reached 0, Wilson safely landed at Gwadar airstrip. Wilson continued his journey across British India, where the press eagerly awaited his arrival. He made his way through India, celebrating his success, and finally reached Purnia in northeast India, close to Nepal's border. However, the long arms of the British government reached him again. At the Purnia airstrip, local police were waiting for him. They seized the plane, and Wilson was surrounded by security guards. The British government reminded him that despite his plane, he still didn't have permission to fly over Nepal. Wilson was now trapped. Not only was his plane confiscated, but he couldn't even fly it anymore. In July 1933, Wilson was forced to sell his plane. His plan to crash land on Mount Everest was completely ruined, but his determination to climb Everest remained. He spent the winter in Darjeeling, India, fasting and praying, continuing to try and get a permit to enter Tibet to climb Everest from the Tibetan side. But every effort failed. Finally, he secretly began making plans to climb Mount Everest. On March 21, 1934, Wilson set off on foot dressed as a Buddhist monk. He crossed Sikkim and reached Tibet. After a couple of attempts, he returned from Everest's base camp because his lack of training and breathing problems made his health deteriorate. By the second attempt in 1934, he set off again with two companions who were experienced climbers. They reached Camp 3 in just 3 days, but Wilson left them behind to climb alone. His companions tried to stop him, but he refused to listen. This was the same stubbornness that could have cost him his life. He told his companions that if he didn't return in 2 weeks, they should assume he was dead. They waited not 2 weeks, but an entire month. When Wilson did not return to Camp 3, his companions descended and reached India. They reported Wilson's death by the end of July. Another British mountaineer had fallen victim to Everest's dangerous world. A year later, in 1935, Eric Shipton's Everest expedition discovered Wilson's body, lying between Mount Everest and Changtse in a pass known as North Col. His diary was found next to him with the last entry on May 31, 1934, reading, "I'm setting off again." What a beautiful day.